OA fined me for the snow they dumped on my land. Not a storm I caused, not a drift I ignored, but snow their trucks unloaded on my property for weeks without asking. The notice arrived like a threat pretending to be policy. Crisp letterhead demanding payment for damage they created. At 6:47 in the morning, the sound of plow blades scraping asphalt ripped me awake before daylight. Diesel engines idled outside my window, heavy and deliberate, like machinery lining up for a job already approved. When I pulled back the curtain, I expected routine clearing, and instead watched 4 HOA trucks angle their beds and dump everything onto my yard. Dirty snow, road salt, sand, and broken ice piled high, sealing my driveway and burning my grass beneath chemical grit. One driver caught me watching and shrugged, as if using my land as a landfill was a favor. My hands shook, not from cold, but from the certainty that this wasn't a mistake. This was HOA Karen turning convenience into punishment. Before we move forward, drop a comment. Where are you watching from? I stood there breathing diesel exhaust and salt while my property disappeared under a mountain that didn't belong to me. The trucks didn't hurry or hesitate, which told me everything about permission and precedent. They finished, pulled away, and left me boxed in like the damage was already resolved. 3 weeks of this had taught me one thing very clearly, and that was intent. Accidents look chaotic, but this was organized, scheduled, and repeated with confidence. HOA Karen didn't need my consent because she assumed I wouldn't challenge her. She counted on routine to silence me and paperwork to exhaust me. She counted on the idea that no one fights City Hall, especially not when it hides behind neighborhood rules. The fine itself was almost insulting in its simplicity. $5,500 for snow accumulation obstructing access and creating safety hazards. They cited my address, my parcel number, my responsibility. They didn't mention their trucks, their routes, or their decision to use my land as the end of the line. Reading it felt like watching someone write your name on a crime they committed. HOA Karen didn't bother to hide the logic because she didn't think she had to. If I paid, the problem became mine. If I didn't, she could escalate until I did. That morning set the tone for everything that followed. The smell of salt lingered for hours, burning the back of my throat every time I stepped outside. The snow wasn't clean or soft. It was compacted waste, scraped from streets and driveways across the entire development. Chunks of ice the size of bowling balls blocked my exit completely. I couldn't leave, couldn't receive deliveries, couldn't move without clearing their mess first. And that was the point. Control doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it just blocks your way and waits for you to apologize. HOA Karen understood leverage better than most people give her credit for. She knew exactly which houses could absorb inconvenience and which ones couldn't. She knew timing mattered, and pressure worked best when someone was already stretched thin. She also knew how to frame aggression as maintenance and punishment as compliance. Every load of snow was a message, and every fine was a reminder of who she believed held authority. From her perspective, this wasn't cruelty, it was efficiency. From mine, it was trespass dressed up as policy. Standing there watching my yard disappear, I realized she had crossed a line she didn't even know existed. She assumed snow was temporary and land was flexible. She assumed I would clear it, pay the fine, and learn the lesson she intended to teach. She assumed I would treat her authority as permanent and my rights as optional. What she didn't account for was that snow, once piled high enough, becomes structure, and land, once boundaries are respected, becomes leverage. The neighborhood stayed quiet while this happened, which was exactly how HOA Karen liked it. Curtains twitched, but doors stayed closed. People watched, but no one intervened. They'd seen this pattern before and learned survival meant staying out of it. HOA Karen thrived in that silence because it let her frame every conflict as isolated and every target as unreasonable. She didn't need allies as long as she had apathy. She didn't need consent as long as she had compliance. By the time the trucks were gone, the damage was complete. My driveway was sealed, my lawn buried, and my patience burned down to something colder and more focused. This wasn't about snow anymore, and it wasn't about a fine. It was about an HOA that believed it could convert private land into public convenience without consequence. It was about a woman who mistook routine abuse for unquestioned authority, and it was about the mistake she made, assuming I wouldn't respond. I didn't rage or shout into the cold air. I didn't call the office or argue with the driver. I stood there and took inventory. I measured the pile, the placement, and the route they used to access my land. I noted the time, the trucks, and the way they entered and exited. Every detail mattered because details turn inconvenience into evidence. HOA Karen thought this was a closed case, but she'd only just opened it. As the sun finally crept over the houses, the snow pile cast a shadow across my yard, like a monument to her confidence. It sat there heavy and unmoving, daring me to accept it. I knew she expected me to clear it myself and send a check like everyone else. I knew she expected frustration, not resistance. What she didn't know yet was that she had handed me material, not a problem. And material, in the right hands, can be turned into something that blocks more than a driveway. This was the moment the balance shifted, even if no one else could see it yet. HOA Karen believed the story ended with a fine and a shrug. I understood it was just beginning, because the snow she used to bury my rights was about to expose hers. That pile of snow didn't land on just any yard. It landed on the one piece of property in the neighborhood that HOA Karen had been quietly leaning on for decades, without paperwork, permission, or accountability. My land sat at the hinge point where their private street met the public road, a narrow stretch everyone used and no one questioned. For years, they treated that access like it belonged to them simply because nobody stopped them. Habit became entitlement, and entitlement became policy, without ever becoming legal. I didn't buy this property to become part of an HOA dispute. I took it because it was available, affordable, and positioned for a fresh start when everything else in my life was already under pressure. The corner lot mattered because it wasn't tucked away or forgettable. It was visible, functional, and strategically important whether anyone wanted to admit it or not. That mattered to HOA Karen long before it mattered to me. The previous owner had been accommodating, the kind of person who waved neighbors through without making a fuss. No paperwork, no recorded easement, just permission given quietly and assumed to be permanent. That kind of arrangement works until it doesn't. And when ownership changes, assumptions die fast. HOA Karen never adjusted to that reality because she didn't think she had to. I didn't grow up trusting authority simply because it wore a badge or letterhead. I spent most of my working life around heavy machinery, regulated environments, and systems where mistakes cost money, safety, or both. In those worlds, permission is documented or it doesn't exist. Boundaries are measured, not implied. And anyone who tells you to just trust them is usually covering for something they can't prove. That mindset didn't come from stubbornness. It came from years of watching what happens when people assume someone else did the paperwork. Machines don't care about assumptions, and neither does property law. Either the line is yours, or it isn't. Either access is granted, or it's trespass. HOA Karen relied on people not knowing the difference. When she dumped that snow, she wasn't just clearing roads cheaply. She was reinforcing a pattern that worked because nobody pushed back. The moment I questioned it, the tone changed. Fines appeared faster. Language hardened. Courtesy vanished. That reaction told me everything about how fragile her authority actually was. HOA Karen spoke in polished phrases meant to sound final. Established use. Community standards. Prescriptive rights. They were words chosen to end conversations, not explain reality. Every time I asked for documentation, she deflected. Every time I pressed for proof, she reframed the question. That wasn't confidence, it was containment. What she didn't understand was that I wasn't asking emotionally. I wasn't threatening or negotiating. I was gathering information. Each fine, each email, each notice became a data point. The more she escalated, the clearer it became that she was operating on inherited assumption, not their legal authority. Neighbors started noticing the shift too, even if they didn't say it out loud. People who'd paid fees for years without question suddenly had questions, not because they liked me, but because the numbers stopped making sense. If that road wasn't actually HOA property, what exactly were they paying for? And if HOA Karen couldn't answer that, what else had been taken on faith? She tried to isolate me early, painting me as uncooperative and difficult. That tactic only works when the target reacts emotionally. I didn't. I stayed procedural, calm, and precise. Every interaction stayed focused on one issue she couldn't resolve without exposing herself. Show me the easement. By the time the snow pile reached its third week, this wasn't just a dispute anymore. It was a test of whether HOA authority existed because it was legitimate or because nobody ever challenged it. HOA Karen believed pressure would end the conversation. She didn't realize pressure was exactly what I was built to withstand. The backstory didn't soften the conflict. It sharpened it. The more I understood how the HOA operated, the clearer it became that the abuse wasn't personal. It was systemic. Snow dumping was just the most visible symptom of a structure that relied on silence, confusion, and fear of escalation. Once I saw that, I stopped reacting and started preparing. HOA. Karen thought my refusal to comply was arrogance. In reality, it was recognition. Recognition that authority without proof is just noise. Recognition that property lines don't move because someone's been crossing them long enough. Recognition that when someone turns convenience into punishment, the only response that works is one grounded in documentation and resolve. By the end of that phase, the roles had already shifted, even if she didn't know it yet. She was still issuing fines and threats. I was already questioning the foundation they stood on. And once you start pulling at that thread, the rest of the structure doesn't hold for long. HOA Karen didn't run the association like a community. She ran it like a funnel, narrowing every decision until it passed through her hands. Board meetings existed, but they were ceremonial, a sequence of nods and approvals that gave the appearance of governance while concentrating power in one place. Emails came from a shared address, but the voice was always hers. Notices carried a collective signature, but the pressure behind them was singular and personal. The structure wasn't designed to deliberate. It was designed to enforce. The enforcement followed a pattern that only became obvious once you stepped out of it. First came the assumption that rules were self-executing, that their authority required no explanation beyond repetition. Then came escalation, not in proportion to any violation but in response to resistance. If you complied, the process ended quietly. If you questioned it, the penalties multiplied. That wasn't coincidence. It was conditioning. The fines proved it. They weren't calibrated to correct behavior. They were calibrated to break momentum. Snow that the HOA dumped became my responsibility the moment it touched my land. When it remained, I was cited for obstruction. When I objected, the amount doubled. When I asked for documentation, the timeline shortened. Each step was designed to make compliance feel cheaper than inquiry. HOA Karen counted on fatigue to do the rest. Her language was precise in the way intimidation always is. Nothing was outright false, but nothing was complete. She leaned on phrases that sounded legal without committing to facts that could be tested. Established use, community necessity, safety hazard. Each term was flexible enough to justify whatever action she wanted to take next. If challenged, she could pivot without admitting error, reframing enforcement as concern and punishment as responsibility. What made the abuse effective was how public it became without being transparent. Mass emails warned residents about dangerous conditions without naming their source. Emergency notices referenced threats without specifying evidence. The goal wasn't accuracy, it was narrative control. By the time anyone asked questions, the story had already been written, and dissent looked like selfishness rather than self-defense. She understood social pressure better than legal pressure. Neighbors didn't need to agree with her to enforce her will. They just needed to fear being next. The structure rewarded silence. Board members stayed passive because they benefited from stability. Vendors stayed quiet because contracts depended on her approval. Residents paid because challenging fees meant becoming visible. HOA Karen didn't need universal support. She only needed universal reluctance. The road maintenance fees were the clearest example. People paid them annually without seeing invoices or breakdowns. The road existed, trucks passed, and snow was removed, so the fees felt justified by routine. No one asked who owned the road or where the money actually went. The HOA didn't offer transparency because it didn't need to. Habit covered the gap where proof should have been. When I pushed back, the structure revealed its teeth. Letters shifted from informational to accusatory. The tone hardened, deadlines shrank, and consequences were outlined in bold. HOA Karen stopped pretending this was about snow and made it about obedience. She framed my questions as disruption, my documentation requests as harassment, and my refusal to pay as hostility toward the community. That inversion was deliberate, designed to isolate me while she consolidated support. I didn't respond publicly, and that unnerved her more than anger would have. Silence broke her script. Instead of arguing, I documented. Every notice, every fine, every claim was logged and dated. Patterns emerged quickly. Enforcement always flowed one way. Accountability never flowed back. The system worked because no one had ever bothered to map it. The board remained quiet as pressure escalated, which told me they either didn't know or didn't want to know. Both options served HOA Karen equally. She spoke for them, and they let her. When authority is borrowed like that, it collapses the moment the lender asks for proof. She didn't realize she was standing on borrowed ground. By the time legal threats entered the conversation, the abuse had crossed from administrative into coercive. HOA Karen asserted ownership rights she couldn't document and threatened consequences she couldn't lawfully impose. She wasn't bluffing out of ignorance. She was bluffing because bluffing had always worked. The structure had trained her to believe that escalation was authority. That belief was the weakness running through everything she controlled. The more pressure she applied, the clearer it became that there was nothing underneath it but assumption and fear. Once that became visible, the structure stopped looking solid and started looking brittle. And brittle systems don't bend when challenged. They crack, loudly, and all at once. The shift from suspicion to certainty didn't happen all at once. It happened in layers, the way truth usually does when it's been buried under years of convenience and intimidation. Once I stopped reacting and started documenting, the noise fell away and patterns sharpened. Every claim HOA Karen made depended on one fragile assumption, that no one would ever verify it. That assumption was the first thing to collapse. The survey was the turning point. Property boundaries aren't opinions, and they don't care how long someone's been getting away with crossing them. When the licensed surveyors arrived, their equipment cut through decades of HOA narrative in a single morning. Laser measurements, metal detectors, original markers pulled from the ground like artifacts. The results were precise and devastating. The road crossed my land by 42 feet. Not approximately, not debatably, exactly 42 feet of daily trespass dressed up as community tradition. That number mattered because it stripped the situation of ambiguity. HOA Karen could no longer hide behind vague language or emotional appeals. The land wasn't disputed, it was documented. And documentation changes everything because it doesn't argue. It just exists. Once the survey was recorded, it became public fact, not private grievance. The reaction was immediate and revealing. Instead of producing an easement, HOA Karen dismissed the survey itself. She questioned the credentials, implied bias, suggested alternative measurements without presenting any. That response told me more than any admission could have. People who have proof don't attack methodology. They produce counterproof. She had none. Neighbors started asking questions, quietly at first. The kind of questions people only ask when they sense something is wrong, but are afraid to say it out loud. Who actually owns the road? Why fees were collected for land not listed on HOA deeds? How snow removal costs were calculated? I didn't answer emotionally. I handed them copies, surveys, deeds, county records. Facts don't inflame, they spread. That spread exposed the next layer, financials. Road maintenance fees that had been paid for years without scrutiny suddenly looked different when paired with ownership records. The HOA had been charging residents to maintain property it did not legally control. Worse, those charges weren't symbolic. They were substantial, recurring, and justified through authority that no longer existed once ownership was disproven. The deeper I went, the more precise the picture became. HOA Karen's management company sat at the center of the money flow. Fees collected, services billed, reimbursements claimed. On paper, it looked orderly. In context, it looked self-serving. Maintenance costs didn't align with actual expenses. Snow removal charges exceeded market rates by multiples. And all of it was justified through the same undocumented assumption of ownership. The real proof came from history. County records don't forget, even when people do. Old correspondence, tax filings, handwritten letters preserved on microfilm. That's where Uncle Pete's permission letter surfaced. Quiet and lethal. He had allowed access temporarily, explicitly, in writing. Permission destroys adverse possession claims because it resets the clock every time. That letter alone dismantled decades of HOA Karen's legal posture. But it didn't stop there. Year after year, Uncle Pete had documented that the access was granted at his discretion. Tax adjustments reflected that acknowledgement. The county accepted it. The HOA never contested it, which meant they knew, or at least should have known. Ignorance stopped being plausible. Then came the tax implications. The HOA had claimed deductions for maintaining property it did not own. That's not a gray area. That's misrepresentation. Once money crosses that line, the issue stops being civil and starts attracting attention from people who don't care about HOA politics. Paper trails like that don't disappear. They accumulate interest. I organized everything methodically. Chronological, indexed, cross-referenced. Surveys matched deeds. Deeds matched tax filings. Tax filings contradicted HOA claims. Every piece reinforced the same conclusion. The HOA's authority over that stretch of land was fictional, and the money collected under that fiction was vulnerable to scrutiny. HOA Karen sensed the ground shifting. Her responses became erratic. Threats escalated faster than her explanations. Legal letters arrived heavy with intimidation and light on substance. That imbalance was the tell. When pressure increases while evidence decreases, collapse isn't far behind. The discovery phase ended the moment she announced intent to formalize adverse possession, despite knowing permission had been granted. That wasn't just aggressive, it was reckless. It transformed a long-standing misuse into an affirmative act of fraud. And fraud doesn't care how confident you sound when you commit it. By then, the proof wasn't just enough. It was overwhelming. The only question left wasn't whether the HOA was wrong. It was how publicly that wrongness would be exposed, and how hard the structure built on it would fall once it was forced to confront reality. The confrontation didn't explode the way movies pretend it does. There was no single shout, no dramatic slam of a gavel that changed everything in 1 second. Instead, it unfolded the way real power collapses. Slowly at first, then all at once, when the weight of its own lies became too heavy to hold. By the time HOA Karen realized what was happening, she was already standing in the wreckage of her authority. The emergency HOA meeting was her idea. That alone told me how badly she'd misjudged the situation. People who still control the narrative don't call emergency meetings. People who feel it slipping through their fingers do. The notice went out with the usual language about misinformation, safety concerns, and community unity. But the subtext was panic. She needed witnesses. She needed control. She needed to look powerful in a room full of people who were starting to question why they'd ever believed her. The community center filled past capacity. Folding chairs scraped across tile as neighbors packed in, whispering to each other instead of avoiding eye contact like they used to. The air was thick with that specific tension that only exists when people know something is wrong, but haven't yet decided how brave they're willing to be about it. I took a seat near the back, quiet, documents in my bag, letting the room do what rooms always do when truth is waiting. It leaned forward. HOA Karen opened the meeting with authority theater. Perfect posture, controlled tone, that smile she used when she wanted to appear reasonable while laying groundwork for punishment. She spoke about standards, about tradition, about how one individual shouldn't be allowed to disrupt decades of established order. She said my name without looking at me, like I was a procedural inconvenience rather than a person. That was her first mistake of the night. When people are already questioning power, dismissiveness doesn't project strength, it confirms guilt. She spent 15 minutes reframing the issue as behavioral rather than factual. Disruptive resident, uncooperative homeowner, threat to community safety. Not once did she mention ownership, easements, or documentation. She spoke around the truth so carefully it became obvious she was afraid to touch it. I watched heads turn, watched brows furrow, watched people mentally compare what she was saying to the copies of surveys and deeds already circulating through the neighborhood. When the floor opened for questions, silence held for a beat longer than she expected. Then someone asked about road fees. Another asked why maintenance costs were so high. Someone else asked whether the HOA actually owned the land in question. Each question was calm, polite, deadly. HOA Karen deflected with practiced efficiency. But deflection only works when people still trust the deflector. That trust was already bleeding out. When she finally acknowledged the land issue, she didn't deny it. She minimized it. She framed the trespass as a technicality, a misunderstanding that would be resolved through formal channels. Then she said the words that ended her. She announced the board's intention to pursue adverse possession to secure community interests. She said it confidently, like authority could substitute for legality. The room changed. Even people who didn't fully understand property law understood theft when they heard it described plainly. Adverse possession isn't neighborly compromise. It's legalized taking, and everyone knew it. That announcement turned discomfort into anger. Not loud anger, focused anger. The kind that doesn't shout because it's busy recalculating loyalties. That was when I stood. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't posture. I asked for documentation again. I asked her to produce the easement she'd referenced for weeks. Again, I asked her to explain how permission granted in writing could possibly support hostile use. Again, each question landed like a dropped weight. She couldn't answer any of them without unraveling her own story. Her response was not evidence. It was threat. She warned about consequences, about fines, about legal action, about what happens to residents who refuse to cooperate. She said it out loud, into a room full of witnesses, cameras recording on phones, people who now understood exactly what cooperation meant to her. Submission. That moment was the collapse. Not because she lost her temper, but because she revealed it. Power that relies on punishment instead of legitimacy collapses the instant people stop being afraid of it. I sat back down without another word. I didn't need to say anything else. The room had heard everything it needed. The meeting dissolved into chaos she couldn't control. People stood, argued, demanded answers she couldn't give. Board members whispered urgently among themselves. Someone shouted about refunds. Someone else demanded an audit. HOA Karen banged the gavel like noise could restore authority. It didn't. Sound doesn't override truth. It just echoes off it. By the time the meeting ended, no motions passed, no resolutions held, and no one looked at HOA Karen the same way again. She left early, tight-faced, phone already in her hand, retreating into the last weapon she had left, lawyers. But even that move was too late. Once power collapses in public, it doesn't reassemble behind closed doors. The confrontation didn't end with shouting or applause. It ended with silence. The heavy, irreversible silence of people who have seen behind the curtain and realized there was nothing holding it up. And from that moment on, every action HOA Karen took only made the collapse louder. Retaliation didn't come in the form of yelling neighbors or angry letters taped to my door. It came quietly, professionally, and with signatures at the bottom of pages that carried far more weight than HOA Karen ever had. That's the part people misunderstand. Real consequences don't arrive with sirens. They arrive with credentials. The first call came the morning after the emergency meeting. Not from a neighbor, not from the HOA. From a surveyor who'd been forwarded my documentation by someone at the county recorder's office. He didn't ask if the survey was accurate. He asked if I wanted a certified confirmation added to the public record. That alone told me how far things had shifted. When professionals start offering to put their names next to yours, it means the paper trail has reached critical mass. Within 48 hours, the land issue stopped being a dispute and became a case study. Surveyors confirmed boundaries. Records clerks pulled historical filings. A title specialist flagged the lack of any recorded easement as a liability risk that should have been disclosed to every homeowner for decades. Each expert added a layer HOA Karen could not peel back. Every signature turned her narrative thinner and mine heavier. Then came the accountants. That part moved faster than I expected. Once homeowners started asking why they were paying for maintenance on land the HOA didn't own, the numbers stopped being background noise and started screaming. Road maintenance fees, snow removal allocations, reserve fund usage. When professionals looked at the books without the assumption of honesty, patterns appeared instantly. Money had been moving confidently because it was never challenged. Now it was being examined line by line. HOA Karen tried to regain control by flooding inboxes with updates written in that familiar corporate tone. Strategic language, ongoing review, commitment to transparency. But transparency isn't something you declare after years of avoiding it. It's something you practice before you're forced to. Every message she sent felt rehearsed, defensive, and late. Worse, they contradicted earlier statements people had saved. The first official notice didn't come from me. It came from the county. A formal inquiry into whether the HOA had been improperly collecting fees tied to land it did not legally control. That phrasing mattered. Improperly collecting isn't a dispute. It's a potential violation. And once that word appears on official letterhead, escalation becomes procedural, not personal. That was when HOA Karen made her second fatal miscalculation. She assumed expertise could be bullied the same way homeowners could. She sent legal threats. She demanded delays. She accused professionals of bias. But experts don't answer to intimidation. They answer to standards. And once they're engaged, they don't leave until the record is clean. The survey confirmation was recorded publicly. The lack of easement was no longer an argument. It was fact. That triggered the insurance side of the collapse. Insurers don't tolerate ambiguity when liability is involved. Questions about unauthorized road usage and improper snow dumping created risk exposure no carrier wants. Coverage inquiries began. Adjusters requested explanations. HOA Karen stopped returning calls. Then came the engineers. Independent, credentialed, boring in the best possible way. They assessed the snow dumping itself, not as drama, but as practice. Where was it placed? What damage it caused? Whether it met any reasonable standard of disposal. Their conclusion wasn't emotional. It was blunt. The practice was improper, unsafe, and transferred liability to a property owner who never consented. That alone exposed the HOA to claims far beyond fines. Every expert involved had something in common. None of them cared about HOA politics. None of them cared about personalities. They cared about records, boundaries, standards, and accountability. That's what HOA Karen never understood. Power built on intimidation collapses instantly when it encounters systems built on verification. The retaliation phase wasn't loud, but it was relentless. Requests for documentation she couldn't provide. Deadlines she couldn't meet. Explanations she couldn't fabricate. Fast enough. Each expert letter narrowed her options. Each professional opinion reduced her room to maneuver. The strategy she'd used for years relied on no one checking. Now everyone was checking at once. Her legal counsel shifted tone. Less aggressive, more conciliatory. They stopped threatening and started asking. That transition was subtle, but unmistakable. Lawyers only change posture when they realize the facts won't support force. Suddenly they wanted dialogue. Suddenly they wanted to discuss resolution. Suddenly they acknowledged uncertainty where confidence had been weaponized before. By the end of that week, the HOA board wasn't united. Emergency sessions were held without notice. Resignations were discussed quietly. People who'd enabled HOA Karen began distancing themselves. Not out of courage, but survival. Expertise had done what outrage never could. It stripped away the illusion of authority and replaced it with documented reality. I didn't push during this phase. I didn't need to. The experts were doing it for me. Every email they sent, every report they filed, every standard they applied moved the situation forward without emotion. That's the most devastating form of retaliation there is. One that doesn't argue. It just proves. By the time the final notices went out, HOA Karen wasn't fighting me anymore. She was fighting systems designed specifically to handle people like her. And systems don't blink. Victory didn't arrive with applause. It arrived with silence. The kind of silence that settles in after authority collapses, and no one is brave enough to pretend otherwise. The snow wall stood exactly where it was built, compacted, reinforced, unmoving, a physical record of every decision HOA Karen had made, in arrogance instead of law. The final notice came 3 days later. Not a threat, not a demand, a concession. The HOA acknowledged in writing that the land was mine, that no easement had ever existed. and that all snow dumping onto my property had been unauthorized. The language was dry, sterile, stripped of the entitlement that had fueled months of pressure. There were no accusations anymore, only admissions. Homeowners stopped avoiding eye contact. Cars idled at the dead end of their street, drivers staring at the wall not with anger, but with understanding. It wasn't blocking them. It was blocking a lie they'd been paying into for years. Every frozen block of snow represented money taken, authority abused, and silence exploited. The emergency board meeting happened without HOA Karen. Her name wasn't on the agenda. It wasn't on the sign-in sheet. It wasn't spoken aloud. Absence did what confrontation never could. The board voted to suspend all enforcement actions related to the disputed area, refund snow-related fines, and begin negotiations for a lawful, recorded easement at fair market value. They did it unanimously. No speeches, no resistance. Just hands raised and lowered. By the end of the week, trucks arrived not to dump snow, but to remove it properly. Licensed, permitted, paid for by the HOA. They worked carefully around the wall, respecting the boundary for the first time in decades. No one asked me to move it. No one told me I had to. They finally understood that permission isn't something you assume. It's something you earn. HOA Karen's resignation was announced in a single sentence buried halfway down an email. No farewell, no explanation, just a vacancy. The board thanked her for her service and moved on, as if she'd never existed. That's how it ends for people like that. Not with exposure, with erasure. The audits continued quietly. So did the refunds. Line items homeowners had never questioned were suddenly corrected. Fees recalculated. Contracts reviewed. Snow disposal moved to approved sites. Maintenance budgets shrank back to reality. The system didn't reform because of morality. It reformed because it was forced to confront facts. The wall stayed up through the rest of winter, not because it had to, but because no one asked for its removal. It became a landmark, a reminder. Parents pointed it out to their kids while driving the long way around. Conversations changed tone. Enforcement letters became rare. Requests replaced demands. I didn't attend the meetings anymore. I didn't need to. The problem wasn't leadership. It was accountability. Once that was restored, everything else followed naturally. Power stopped being personal and started being procedural again, exactly where it belongs. When spring came, the wall melted slowly, evenly, leaving the ground beneath it intact. The grass came back stronger than before. The property line remained unchanged. No one crossed it without consent. No one pretended they could. HOA Karen never contacted me again. Not an email, not a letter, not an apology. She didn't argue. She didn't explain. She vanished from the only arena where she'd ever felt powerful. That silence said more than any confrontation ever could. The street reopened under a lawful agreement weeks later. Recorded, paid, transparent. It cost the HOA more than it would have if they'd done it right the first time. That wasn't punishment. That was math. I didn't celebrate. I didn't post signs. I didn't tell the story to prove a point. The result spoke for itself. The snow wall didn't teach a lesson. It enforced a boundary. HOA Karen went quiet.